Hi everyone, welcome back again at the weekly webinar series of Effectory, your weekly dose of inspiration of how to deal with the most important assets in your company, your people. My name is Arjen Swank and I'm your host for this week. I'm very glad and happy to see you guys all back in the presentation that we have for you today, which will be facilitated by my colleague Axel Schiphof, one of the consultants of Effectory, who will share how to keep engagement high during these times of crisis. How do you commit your people to the jobs that they're doing and the organization? Last week we looked at the trends in the HR space with Tom Haak, director of the HR Trend Institute, and he predicted how we can use the latest developments as an accelerator for your company and your organizational development rather than having it hold you back. This week Axel will share how to keep that engagement of your people high. In a few weeks' time, we've all become remote workers. We're now in our home offices. And during this time, this might influence the way how you look at your jobs, how you look at your way of purpose, of your feeling of belonging to the organization that you're working for. And Axel will share the latest insights of what he knows from working with different clients, but also from the weekly COVID pulses that we're launching around the world at this moment. As you know, after the presentation, there's a live Q&A, so please do send your questions. You know how it works. The form below will help you to share it with us, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. And we'll share the recordings of the webinar after today with you in your emails, and you can go to your YouTube channel. The YouTube channel of Effectory has been freshly updated to host all the webinar recordings. All right, over to you. Welcome, Axel. I'm really happy that you're here.
Hey, Arjen, thanks for having me.
Sure. Let me just start with a personal question. How is your engagement right now?
It's pretty good, very different. As you can imagine, I used to spend a lot of time with clients traveling, so it wasn't necessarily a lot in the office to begin with. But now in these times, I already got excited when I was finally able to bike to the office today for this webinar. So yeah, it's quite different. Yeah.
Cool, can imagine. So just on a macro level, we've seen that different countries, they're lengthening their lockdown periods. France, the UK, we see that people now find the implications of working from home longer. How do you think that will influence engagement, like now, but also on the long-term engagement of people?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's right at the heart of what we're talking about today. I think what we see now are still the initial effects of this whole crisis and the crisis mode that we're in. Mm-hmm. So I think initially there's some positive influences on people and their engagement, but in the longer term, I think we'll have a much larger challenge to keep those levels up. And hopefully today will help everyone listening and watching to help figure that out for their organizations.
Cool. Perfect. Thanks so much. Really interesting. I'm actually very excited for your story. So yeah, please do take us along and share what you found.
Great. Thank you so much. So what we're doing today is we're just going to look at 4 things. So I think before we can talk about how to keep engagement high and to share with you what we see in organizations across the world, I think we first need to dive a little bit into the story of why it matters, especially now. After that, we'll take a look at what we see, and we'll talk a little bit about what you can do about it. And then, of course, I want to end up with room for any of your questions. And Arjen will sort through them and pick out the most interesting ones. Now, what I really want to start with today is acknowledging the privileged situation that we're in. Arjen and myself are in good health. We have the opportunity, the freedom to talk about a topic like this. I think this is not true for a lot of people. So keeping that in mind, I think today I'm super happy to be doing this with you, and hopefully you at home are healthy and in good spirits as well. But it does beg the question, right? So in this time, isn't talking about engagement a rather trivial matter when so much else in the world right now is about life and death? And I think, once again, bearing our privilege in mind, I think for the future of your organization, the decisions that we make right now on how to treat our people and whether or not to prioritize engagement is actually going to make a critical difference in the future of your organization. So with that privilege, I think it's especially important right now. And I think what's really crucial to think about right now is how are we going to get out of this crisis? So how do we end up on the other side? Of course, this crisis is happening to us. So we don't necessarily have anything to say about the way down, the slide down that we're going through at the moment. But we do have a lot to say about how we're going to act after it. So once we've reached our bottom and we can slowly start getting up again, how do we get up? And that has everything to do with engagement. So we know that some kind of recession is coming across the globe. So we know that we need to be doing more with less. And that's very much, I think, about your people and making sure that they continue to contribute to your organization. But it's especially about the innovation power that you as an organization have. So, like I said, we're all busy sliding down into this deeper recession. The question is, how do we get up afterwards? And that really means that you need to be getting up a little bit better or faster than your competition. And I think we misconstrue innovation from time to time, and we only think about it in terms of products and services. But it's also very much about your internal processes, your customer friendliness, your marketing, your brand. So all of these things are ready to be innovated in this time especially, so that when things settle down and we've entered a new normal, we can actually get back up faster. Because, and I assume that many of you are in HR, this is the story that we need to tell inside our organizations first, before we can actually start working on engagement. So making sure that this story is told and that we're not just caring about our people based on some kind of moral assessment, because we know that, as soon as money is involved, that's going to be a very shaky foundation to work on. So it's not just a moral thing where we need to care for our people, but very much also a business thing, why we need to make sure that our people are enabled and at least aligned with some kind of purpose. So that's what we're going to be talking about more right now. Now, at Effectory, we actually take a look at engagement from two different perspectives. So we take a look at the organization, so how employees relate to whatever organization you work for, and how they relate to their work. So the actual job, the tasks that they need to do day in, day out. Now, assuming that you're not some kind of shitty organization that has already fired a couple of hundred people, when it comes to that dynamic between employee and company or organization, you're probably doing fine. So the initial bump that we see in the results of our surveys is that people are extremely grateful to still have a job. There's an external factor uniting them, and people really want to put their best foot forward to make sure that the organization thrives. So for now, at least, this bump is, I think, very real and very positive. When we take a look at the work element, though, that's slightly different. So we know from experience that if anything changes around us, so for example, reorganizations, layoffs, a change in leadership, or changes to our work, the first thing that happens is that we get distracted. So we derive less meaning from our work, we enjoy it less, and that's kind of the first victim when things around us change. Now, the second thing that we know is that permanent remote workers actually are harder to keep engaged than people that do have some kind of physical office space to convene, to come together and work together, of course. So these are, I think, a couple of things that we need to keep in mind looking forward. And especially in the longer term, like I said, after the initial effects wear off, I think that those are things to really look out for, because they're not a given, but they do require our explicit attention. All right, so what do we see so far? Now, I want to say already, of course, that we have a lot of these surveys still running. So this is a very much an evolving data set. So over time, we're going to be able to give you updates, whether in webinars or in blog posts, to see how this, how these scores continue to evolve. But what we see already, at least, is that about 75% of people is really satisfied with the way that their organization manages this crisis. And that's, of course, an important starting point. Additionally, we see that well over 70% is still confident about the future in their organization, but we do already see that that's lower than the regular scores before this whole crisis started. Furthermore, we see that about 84% of people are really enabled to work remotely, which is, of course, like a hygiene factor, a really primary requirement to even do their work. So organizations have been really good kind of scrambling in this panic mode to get their IT systems working and scaling up and providing their employees with what they need. Not true for all organizations, however. Now, as you can imagine, this crisis affects us all. It has us thinking about ourselves, our partners, our families, our friends, and we really see that worry kind of filter through in the results. And if you're familiar with Maslow's pyramid of needs, you'll know that physical certainty, or at least certainty about your physical conditions, such as health, having a roof over your head, they're extremely important, and it's the foundation that you build everything else on. And we see that this is very much an issue. So when we talk about getting distracted from work, having these things happen around you, of course, is quite detrimental. Furthermore, and I think this is the biggest shocker to me at least, is that only about 66% believe that despite being enabled, they're actually able to work effectively. So we'll talk a little bit more about distracting factors at home, but given the fact that we're still in this stage of getting used to this new situation, not knowing a lot of things, it's quite interesting to see how this productivity is actually still at a level that we don't want it to be at. And this is, I think, quite interesting also when we look at what people tell us in the open commons. So we have a ton of data, not just quantitative, but also very qualitative. And there's a couple things that, at least to me, pop out really. And I think to start with, like I said, we have this crisis. It's an external uniting factor. So we see a lot higher cohesion inside the organization, and that also leads to better collaboration. So collaboration between teams is definitely happening more, of course, inside the limitations of working remotely. And I think one of the best comments that I read was someone said, "Oh, I've never heard back from our IT department as quickly as I have now." So there's this sense of, hey, we're in it together, and people are really willing to help each other out. Additionally, especially if you work in a larger organization, you tend to see that everything is structured, rules, processes, procedures, things to go through. And it's interesting to see how much of that has just fallen away completely in this crisis. So a lot of rules, procedures that you need to follow before, they're no longer useful, they're no longer necessary, and that is making work a little more agile, more nimble. And people are really happy with that. You can't blame them. Additionally, we see kind of a first split happen in workload levels. So you can imagine that there's natural departments or natural functions in your organization where people are really extremely busy compared to before the crisis, whereas in other places in the organization, things are coming to a halt. People are kind of wondering about how to meaningfully spend their time. And this is, of course, also something that we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, one of the main issues that employees face is that they're very unclear on what's expected of them in this weird situation. And just this morning, I was looking at the results of a client of ours, where on the one hand, the organization was giving a sense of understanding, like, hey, we understand that you can't do all your work and that you can't work as much as you're used to, given the fact that you're at home with kids or whatever. But in addition to at least expressing on the surface some kind of understanding, the formal requirements for people exactly the same. So people are still required to reach certain levels of productivity, certain levels of output, working 8 hours a day. So that's kind of interesting where, for the sake of it, well, we understand your predicament. In reality, things are quite different. And this is very difficult for people to deal with because they just don't know what's expected of them. And of course, crucial to address moving forward. I've touched on it a little bit already, but we really see a lot of distractions at home. Of the people that can't work effectively, we see that over 75% has an issue doing so because they have their kids at home. So this is a huge strain, I think, on every organization, and of course that aggregates up to a higher level when we look at economies and societies. So.
All right, Axel, I'm actually getting a few questions in which relate directly to what you're saying now, so I want to address them directly to you. I think especially for this last one, there's some interest for people who are asking us, so how does this differ per function group? Do you see differences among certain types of workers?
Yeah, so we definitely do. So when we split the results into different countries, different functions, we see interesting differences. So I think the first split that you want to make is, okay, for who has work remained relatively unchanged, right? So people, for example, are male men and women, people in healthcare, et cetera. Yeah, their work, they're still going to their places of work, and they certainly need to take extra precautions, but it is different for them. So I think the main differentiators when we look at people that work from home, it's really about how meaningful is your work still. So to what extent can you contribute to daily operations? And to what extent do you need to be more pushed towards developing new things or that innovation that we talked about beforehand? So that really helps specifically. What I expect is that IT people have been super busy and quite interested in their work because it does offer a challenge. And that as soon as things are up and running and they stay that way, I think they'll drop a little bit further. Same goes for HR. I mean, it's a very challenging time for HR, and it's also, of course, a great situation to show your employees how you view them and what you can do for them. So we do see pretty high engagement on the HR side. I think the critical note that I have to make there is, of course, that in terms of workload, it shouldn't get too crazy in order for that engagement to actually fall back down again.
And if you look at culture, there's a question whether business culture influences in any way these engagement levels?
Absolutely. So, and this was true long before this COVID-19 crisis. Mm-hmm. No, I think culture is one of the primary factors determining how engaged people are. And especially if you're an international organization and you work across cultures, across borders, it's super interesting to kind of place a corporate culture on top of those national differences in order to help unify people and to bring them together with a common purpose. So that definitely helps engagement. It also has to do a lot with how much freedom you give your people and how much room you give them to kind of develop themselves. So these, I think, are key issues. And if you're looking at clients of ours that are more rigid in structure and hierarchy, we definitely see lower levels of engagement than in organizations where people get more freedom to do what they're really good at.
So really the autonomy actually helps in terms of determining your own job craft maybe or what you're going to do on a daily basis, as long as you have the feeling of providing purpose for that organization. Do I understand you right?
Absolutely, and I think this is another reason why this is such an interesting time from our perspective at least, is that a lot of control-based companies now have a lot harder time to actually control their employees because they're no longer in their physical line of sight, but rather either they're attempting to control people in different ways, so tracking hours logged on, or with some hesitation, they're having to give up some of that control because it's just no longer possible to do it as well as before.
Wow. Well, I'm really eager to dive into a discussion about also your mention about innovation. This relates to new structures. Tom Haak mentioned it last week as well. But I think there might be some solutions that you're going to provide as well based on these outcomes, I guess. So maybe we first dive into that.
Yeah.
And then we follow on the discussion.
Great. Yeah. So I think this is the perfect segue. Thank you. So knowing what's happening in the organization that work with us, that we've measured in, the question now becomes, okay, what can we do? So how can we actually improve engagement levels in the organization? And I think before we get into the more practical stuff, I think there's two mentality shifts that we need to make. So first and foremost, in that mindset adjustment, and Tom Haak mentioned this, Guido mentioned this, the way you treat your people right now will be remembered first and foremost by your employees and later on also by your clients, especially if you're supplying directly to consumers. So being kind is super important, and being clear is super important, because that confusion that we mentioned before is really difficult for people to deal with in terms of what am I supposed to deliver. Secondly, and this is something that I also noticed myself struggling with, you get into this crisis and you think, oh, it'll be over in a couple weeks, a couple months, and although there's so much still unclear, I think we're coming to the realization that this is going to be a longer term problem and a very new situation that we need to get used to. So as soon as we individually, as well as organizations, adopt this long-term mindset, we can actually start designing our organizations to make the most of the situation, rather than looking at it as something that we just need to get through and then we'll go back to normal. So I think this mentality shift needs to happen first, and then there's a couple more practical things that you can do. So we're a couple weeks in this crisis. If by now certain people in your organization are still having difficulty doing their work, at least at a basic level, then you're doing something wrong. So thankfully, most people feel really enabled to work remotely or in any other way if they're still working as they used to, but at least they feel enabled to do their work. But hygiene factor, primary requirement, make sure that your people get to do their work. Even before this crisis, there were so many organizations that we help that still have issues supplying tools and resources to their people to do their work, which is beyond me, because if you're paying people to do certain work, why would you stop paying for the stuff that they need to actually do that work? So first and foremost, make sure that if there's any issues in enabling your people to do their work, they need to be resolved ASAP. At the same time, I think we also can give a shout out to most IT departments, because they've been able to scale up quite quickly. And I think Effectory's IT department is an excellent example of that, because these guys have been really great in making sure that RN and I and everyone else can get to work. But it won't surprise you that if you're enabled, we see that people are 63% more productive. They're way better able to support their clients, internal or external, and they're able to collaborate better. Not rocket science, but we have the data to back this up. Now, secondly, after enabling your people, we really need perspective and purpose in order to remain engaged. So once this initial bump wears off, in the longer term, we see that this is the major predictor of engagement levels. And this is going to stay the case in this crisis, especially now that there are certain industries being almost disrupted by this crisis that may be way less relevant after this thing is finally over. So, for example, will the airline and tourism industry ever be the same, really? I'm not sure, because they may need to innovate, not just in the short term managing this situation, but also in the longer term. How can we still stay relevant? The event industry, I think, is another great example of an industry that's really being shaken to its core. So whether unless you're in the hand sanitizer business or making face masks, this crisis is going to affect you as an organization. And this offering perspective, so what can we do to remain relevant? Changing purposes where needed, because this is such a fundamental shift that we're going through, is super important. So it's one of the major predictors of engagement. And for the companies in our Pulse database that do offer that perspective and purpose better than the rest, we see that there's a way higher confidence in the future, both personal as well as when it comes to the fate of the organization. We also see that people recommend their employers way more to others, so what we call the eNPS. And I know that most companies right now have some kind of hiring freeze, but as soon as that is lifted, you want your own people to be the best possible recruiters, and this eNPS is excellent for that. Now, this is also the time, especially for the teams, the functions, the departments in your organization that have less to do than normal, to upskill them. So, of course, the primary reaction of a lot of organizations is to cut funding for learning and development. And although I understand that impulse, I think if you look at the organization's interest and not just at the individual employee's interest, it's super interesting to now kind of identify which skills, which competences are going to be extremely relevant a couple weeks, months, years down the road, and invest in them right now. So there's no reason other than just looking at the personal employee perspective to stop L&D if it's going to help, for example, your power to innovate later on. What we know is that 25% more of your people will leave if they're offered insufficient development opportunities. So once again, if we think longer term, this is going to be a crucial area to focus on. Now, if you open up LinkedIn, you see all these incredible, heartwarming examples of companies doing their best to virtually still come together, whether it's through shared coffee moments, shared lunch tables, maybe drinks at the end of Friday afternoon. And I think if we look at the long-term engagement levels of permanent remote workers, this is something that you need to keep doing. And not just in these initial stages, but it's going to remain relevant for the longer term, even as we start maybe going back to the offices again in shifts and keeping that 6 feet economy going. This sense of cohesion that's still quite strong in this crisis mode, it's going to wear off and it needs maintenance. So we need to make sure that it stays there. So I really recommend all of our clients to purposely think about how to do this and also, of course, allow for initiatives from your people to come up. Now, one of the most interesting things, of course, is, okay, how can we use this time to innovate? And with all these decreasing revenue levels and this crisis that we're looking at, I think if we look at innovation, most of your organization's innovation power, you're already paying for it because it's your people, right? So I'm not talking about incredible R&D budgets or purchasing expensive technology. You're already paying for all your people. So I think it's now a great time to actually extract all of their wisdom, all of their ideas, and see what you can do better. And like I said, it doesn't necessarily need to be about your products and services, although for some companies that's going to be the case. But it can also be about your internal processes. It's going to be about your customer friendliness. It's going to be about your brand, your marketing. You can innovate all of these different areas of your company, and you'll need your people in order to kind of figure out, okay, what's the best way to go, but also, of course, to do the work while you're still in this weird situation. Now, we see that in organizations where this innovation is top of mind, we see that way more people are actually encouraged to leave their ideas and suggestions with the organization. And even before the crisis, I think we see that the strongest organizations that we get to work with are the ones that are really able to structurally listen and use the ideas of their people. So not just have them focus on the narrow job description that they have, but allow them to take a broader view on things and contribute where they can. And that brings me to my last point. So, these are unprecedented times, which is, of course, super interesting from an organizational development perspective, because it also means that we're going to be doing things that we're not used to. And, we tend to think in job descriptions quite a bit. We tend to think in these narrow pillars, and we tend to think in quite clearly defined responsibilities and areas of work. I think this is going to be an ideal test for your organization to allow people to step up and to contribute to the organization in whatever way, shape, or form. So whether that's bringing knowledge and ideas to innovating your processes or whatever, or giving yoga lessons to your colleagues in order to get that sense of cohesion up and running, keep it alive for the longer term. So letting go of standard job descriptions in this time of crisis is going to be super interesting, and allowing your people to step up, I think, will be a very interesting test of how well you're doing in terms of engagement. So before we get to the Q&A, to recap. First, especially if you're in HR and you talk to management teams, you talk to CFOs, people that are maybe more willing to slash certain budgets and certain costs than you are, we need to tell the story of engagement. So why is this going to matter in coming out of this crisis better than you were before? or at least better than your competitors. So until we tell that story, we won't be able to get that support to keep that focus on people engagement. Secondly, once again, I think the sooner we start switching to this long-term mentality where we understand that we're going to be in the situation for some time, and it might actually be a precursor to whatever the new normal is going to be, the better. So no longer think of it as something that we need to get through and we'll get back to normal after. No, this is going to stay in some way, shape, or form after even the worst part is over. Finally, please make sure that you enable your people, that you offer that perspective and purpose, especially if the original purpose that your organization has become less relevant. Make sure that you spend wisely on training and education, especially when it comes to skills that you can still use a couple months down the road. Come together, keep doing that, so make sure that these initiatives stay alive and really allow people to still feel part of something bigger, this sense of community, not just in the initial crisis phase, but in the longer term. And then, of course, innovate as much as you can and take a broader view of what innovation can actually mean and give room to your people to show what they're actually capable of. All right, that's it for me. Let's see what kind of questions have come in.
Great, thanks so much, Axel. That was very inspiring. I think really valuable lessons for a lot of people working with people, but also for managers, for decision makers on the key topics of how to address this kind of issue during the next few months, or maybe even longer. I think you're mentioning this rather as a marathon than as a sprint, so this is something to switch our mindsets to. There are still many interesting questions coming in, so please do keep sharing them via the form below. I'm just going to read a few out, and then I'll see which ones you feel are going to be the ones that are going to determine the future, let's say. This is quite interesting from Eileen. She asks us, how can you help engage members of the team, such as office administrators or receptionists that are very much linked to being physically present in an office? Because we talked about home workers, but there's also still 40% of the people still at their jobs at the location itself. Can we do something extra? They might be fearful, they might have difficulty of coming to the office in the first place, having a fear of getting infected. What do you think? How to engage them?
Yeah, so I think the start of the answer is, of course, making sure that people feel safe as much as possible. But hopefully that's not new to anyone listening out there. I think additionally, and this is a discussion I have more often, these supporting functions, they still play a very crucial role in your organization, but they don't necessarily always get that appreciation. So appreciating all your people, of course, but especially those unsung heroes, so to speak, that keep your organization up and running, and make sure that they themselves also understand, okay, this is the role that you're playing in the continued success and the bigger picture. Those are, I think, some key elements to make sure that people understand that what they do actually matters.
Mm-hmm. Smart. Now, this is on the other hand, you briefly touched on culture. Sarah's asking us, okay, so what is your recommendation to maintain culture among remote workers?
Yeah. So, of course, this depends on what your culture is and how clearly defined it is. But I think when it comes to certain values that organizations define, it's about transforming them into more of a virtual digital world. Mm-hmm. It's also, I think, and this is true of culture before and after the corona crisis, it's important to make it explicit, right? So whether you're no longer meeting virtually, it's still about discussing behavior, about written and unwritten rules, about the quality and traits that you're looking for in people that are going to join your organization. So it's really a matter of, I think, continuing that conversation and making sure that you repeat this topic from a central level as well, that you have your leaders set the right example. And I think, of course, Guido talked about leadership extensively in his first webinar. So if you missed that, go back to the YouTube channel 2 weeks ago. Guido talked about the 9 lessons for management. So, and I think management, leadership, they have a crucial role to play in setting the right example, in setting the tone for the culture of the organization. And they're going to have to continue to do so, but maybe even more explicitly because you're so spread out with all these remote workers. So it really needs to stay top of mind, I think.
Okay, and do you see a difference between line management and top management? I mean, do they take different roles? How do you look at that communication-wise?
Yeah. So I think if I hope for one thing to happen, is that we become less reliant on line management. So if we trust people to be adults and to work as they should from home to the best of their ability, I think that's going to take some of the traditional leadership things out of leadership. So line managers are going to take on a much more coaching role, I think. And I think the personal approach to your team members is crucial. I think if you look at both the best and the worst case examples that we see happening in the world right now, they have to do with how personal and how human-centered you are. And I think that's the key role for line management. Senior management, so boards, management teams, they really need to set that purpose. They need to offer that perspective and, of course, lead by example, but that's true for all kinds of leadership.
And Jana is actually asking us, how can we then build trust between managers and employees rather than investing too much time into controlling? So what you're saying is, yeah, culture is something that you make explicit, you tell people what it is, but it feels like a control mechanism then maybe. How do you invest in trust, or how should we build that trust between them?
Yeah, so it starts, of course, with your organization's identity. So what type of organization do you want to be? What kind of employer do you want to be? And if that's already based on things like control or an inherent distrust, you're going to have a hard time changing that, let's say, on a team level. So that's something that needs to happen, I think, higher up. But trust is about getting to know one another, understanding where you come from, understanding what it is that you need, and what you have to offer. So it's a slow process. I think one of my favorite Dutch sayings is that trust comes on foot, but it leaves on a horse. And this crisis may actually be the best possible time to show show your people that you trust them, even though you may have been a little bit different about that in the past. So it's also very much an opportunity, once again, bearing our privilege in mind, because I know that not everyone gets to talk about these topics like we are right now.
Good, thanks. So Jasper's then asking us specifically on engagement. We talked about the role of top management here. He's asking, so how would you convince your CEO that employee engagement is relevant even now while he's in survival mode and just focused on cost?
Yeah, so I don't want to take away anything from that focus on cost. So I think there's going to be a lot of cost cutting. I mean, we're realistic enough about that. But I think that the question is, where do you do that? And there are some people way smarter than I am that can make the right decisions there. But I think if you take the longer term vision, cutting costs in your own innovation power is, for example, going to be detrimental. Because this, whatever size of the recession, it's going to affect us all, once again, unless you're producing hand sanitizer, face masks, or other highly required products. But we really have more of an agency in how we get out of there. And I think if your CEO, your CFO, because they tend to also be quite on the cost-cutting side, if we can convince them of the longer-term innovation power of engaged employees, and we have the data to back that up. I mean, if you just look at higher productivity, better customer service, lower rates of absenteeism, all of those are directly related to your engagement levels. So I think if we get to tell this story, then I think what we do and this talk that I'm giving today is not necessarily meant for HR, but it's very much a business-wide topic to discuss as well. And I think we need to get it out of that HR corner and make it front and center part of your strategy. So I hope that helps a little bit.
I guess. I mean, if I look at what you're saying as well, if I hear your response in terms of, let's say, actual management versus long-term, what you're saying as well is that people should shift their mindset into, wait a minute, this is going to take longer. on the other hand, we still need the people once we're out of this, in whatever form that will be. We still need our people to let's say, start the business up again, or start running, let's say.
Yeah. No, and I think organization, they do need to take some personal responsibility in that, right? So we've seen examples of CEOs just laying off people via video message. I mean, beyond belief. But and at the same time, we see companies so for example, last year, about 180 of these extremely large multinational companies, they signed a covenant saying, okay, we're no longer going to be exclusively focusing on shareholder value, but we're also going to focus on our employees and the communities that we're active in. Mm-hmm. Now, some of those companies will hopefully adhere to that, but we already see it flying out of the window in a couple of instances. So I think we need to appeal to this sense of responsibility, and hopefully also rebuild in a different way. So, and I know this is true in the Netherlands and a lot of other countries as well, but those government support schemes, those regulations giving money out to companies, I'm so happy that comes with the condition of not laying people off. So I think there's things to do on a government side as well, but we really need to appeal as consumers as well, I think, to the responsibility that these companies are or are not taking. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you have, this is a question from Margarita, she's asking us, so can we deal in a specific way between the differences between essential professions and the guys who now hear, well, you're not actually having an essential job? How to provide purpose or perspective for these guys that consider for themselves, okay, so if I'm not essential, how do I stay engaged in my job then?
Yeah. So I think from a very meta perspective, I think we contribute obviously to a running economy with which we can pay taxes and provide services to people that can't. So there's that kind of meta perspective. To make it more concrete, though, I think we're going to find out that certain companies or certain industries, and maybe even certain functions, they're going to have less or maybe no relevance at all after this is said and done with. So, it's, I think, really about upskilling, or in that case, reskilling, to looking at, okay, what are we going to need in the longer run, if at least the fundamental nature of those jobs is no longer what it used to be. So it's to think about creating different categories. And if there's a longer term perspective still for people that are less essential right now, I think it's putting them to work in other ways that can help the company. So I can give you Effectory's example. We just created a bucket of work where everyone that has some time on their hands can kind of put their hand up and say, hey, I want to take care of this and start working on it. And that's, I think, how we're already improving our internal processes and things that we can ultimately deliver to our clients. Mm-hmm. So, there's enough work to be done still. It's just, I think, about being creative about it.
Cool, great, thanks so much. So I'm actually rounding off. We're already close to the time limits for our 45 minutes. So I want to present you with this final question. I find it very relevant myself as well, because it links also to a situation Tom Haag shared last week. So Frederick is asking, Tom Haag predicted a new way of organizing our businesses. We're actually now only in the process of digitizing old habits. Soon we will be innovating in new ways of cooperating, maybe asynchronous meetings, he said as an example. We have an example in one of the questions that says, well, Friday drinks and coffee moments are now done digitally, but yeah, how to keep remaining digital in other ways? And do we have other innovations, let's say, that we can think of once this COVID-19 6 feet social distance economy is started to take shape? And maybe you can share with us, okay, how can we ensure people remain committed, loyal, connected to the organization, even when we're not at the office? Yeah.
So it starts with your company purpose and the perspective that you can offer to your people. So, that's going to remain true. What I think in a more digital world, it does need to be stronger, right? So, for example, we've already seen that over the last couple of years, that communication streams have multiplied and people have all these different sources of information. So if you really want to get a message across as, let's say, senior management or as a team leader, you need to communicate more and more. I think this is especially true if people are more scattered and working remotely. So being super clear and keep repeating this purpose over and over until, for example, we come in and we can ask everyone in your organization, hey, do you know what this company stands for? That they give the same answer. So I think that's super important. And that's really about the connection between employee and organization. When we take a look at the work, I think the main ingredients are going to remain the same for this recipe. It's about autonomy. It's about room for development. It's about being able to do something that you're proud of, whatever that may mean for you. And it means that your tasks line up with your abilities. So that you don't put people like me to work in, let's say, Excel 8 hours a day, because I'd be super unhappy and very unproductive. But that you rather take a look at, okay, what can they do? And how can we kind of move from these standard job descriptions to a more fluid way of okay, interest-based working, of course, respecting all the work that needs to be done. So hopefully that gives a starting point.
I think so. Well, thanks so much. I think thanks so much on behalf of myself, but also from all the viewers, all the people that dialed in. It was really a pleasure to have you here and share your knowledge and experience. I'm also really happy with the questions that we got in. So guys, thanks so much. Actually, next week we're going to have in this webinar Kilian Wawu. He is now an assistant professor at VU University, a specialist in performance management and reward systems. And he's going to share the future of rewarding. But it's interesting because he comes from a background as a banker. So he was an international banker working in Monaco, Belgium, India, in the Netherlands. And now he's switched jobs, switched to a, let's say, purposeful future. And he's going to share with us what the future of payments of rewards will be. Are we going to still have salary payments, holidays, benefits packages, bonuses? Or is it something after this crisis that we didn't even deem possible? It's free time? Are we only going to work 4-hour weeks or 4-hour days now that we've experienced doing that with homeschooling? I'm, well, quite curious to see what he's going to share with us. As a final detail, of course, you can register via the link. You can now also find all the future webinars and all the future speakers on our website. So I'm inviting you to join that. And of course, view this recording of the webinar via the link that we're going to share in your email. Or just go to the Effectory YouTube channel where all the webinars will be presented. Okay, thanks again and thanks so much. And I hope to see you again next week. Stay safe.